Welcome to the podcast. I'm Danielle Goodrick, Knowledge Product Manager at CIPS, and joining me today is Colin Linton. Hi, Colin.
Hi, Danielle.
Great to have you here today. Colin has been CIPS qualified for 25 years and a Fellow of the Institute for 10 years. In recent years, he's been involved in research into a number of different areas, but primarily focused on negotiation and contract management. So today's focus in the podcast will be on strategic negotiations. Negotiation skills have been hugely important over the course of the last year and highlighted as one of the top skills in demand for 2021. In this podcast, you'll learn the difference between negotiation strategy, strategic negotiations, have some tips on negotiations and tactics, and how to become a smart negotiator. So Colin's now going to take you through some slides for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a chat at the end. So Colin, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Danielle. The first thing I'll say is that strategic negotiating isn't the same as negotiation strategy. You need to consider negotiation strategy in every single negotiation, but of course, not every negotiation will be strategic. Sounds confusing, but actually it isn't. Normally we can tell quite easily if the negotiation is going to be more strategic in nature. So how will we know? This is a continuum and is showing either end of the spectrum. So of course, in reality, we can be at intermittent points along the continuum. So probably easier if I explain tactical negotiations because they are more obvious. So we will know with a tactical negotiation that the contract that we're negotiating with the other party will be of lower importance. It will be by nature lower risk, lower value, where of course the converse applies that when we're looking at strategic negotiating, these will be our more significant contracts, higher value and higher risk. With tactical negotiations, these will be much more transactional, one-off, maybe just one very short negotiation, maybe even an email exchange. Whereas with strategic negotiating, they will tend to be more continuous, ongoing, more collaborative relationships. I've already mentioned tactical negotiations will be quicker. Strategic negotiations will be lengthy, could comprise a number of different meetings, a number of different exchanges. They will be more complex in nature, whereas tactical negotiations will be much more straightforward. Often with tactical negotiations, we just do it on our own, whereas with a strategic negotiation, because it's more important to the organisation, they will often involve a team. And generally speaking, with tactical negotiations, they will be light touch in terms of stakeholder engagement, whereas with more strategic negotiating, it'll be a broader range of stakeholders and a much higher level of involvement. Just to reiterate, so these are the extremes. So we can be at points in between. Deciding the approach, this is something that's really important to any negotiator, but particularly for a strategic negotiator. And really thinking through about the drivers and thinking about how important the contract is to us and our organisation. Now, we can use these tools to reinforce whether or not the negotiation is likely to be more strategic in nature. On the left, we see the tried and tested developed by CrowdGIC, our supply positioning based on the variables of relative value to the organisation and the risk complexity. Obviously here, things which are high value, high risk, more strategically important in nature. Therefore, it follows that the likelihood is that the negotiation would be more strategic. On the right-hand side, this is based on my own research, this concept of contract leadership. This is based on variables of the level of formality, the level of formalization required, and the level of proactive engagement with stakeholders. So follows that the greater the level of formalization that's required and the more proactive engagement that's required with stakeholders, the greater the likelihood that this negotiation would be strategic. A good negotiator will possess a whole range of different skills, which we'll talk about these in a moment. But really, one of the fundamentals to strategic negotiating is to understand that success is often about the way that we behave and the way that we interact, and not necessarily based purely on the technical, harder components of that negotiation. So a strategic negotiator will really understand the importance of soft skills, using different tools and techniques to persuade and influence people. So they will understand that how they behave towards somebody will elicit a reaction. They also really understand a very important concept, and that's when we're negotiating on behalf of our employer, that we are a professional negotiator. So it sounds grand. If you do this as part of your job, then add it to your CV. You are a professional negotiator. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that you're paid to get the best deal that you can for your employer. That's why you're being paid. Okay, so you're a professional negotiator, and that means doing what it takes within, obviously, ethical and professional boundaries, but doing what it takes to get the very best deal that you can for your employer. So this means that you need to be prepared to be flexible and adaptable, and to change given the circumstances. Building a toolkit of skills and tactics and other attributes. Also, a good negotiator will have very, very clear goals, so they will be very clear when they go into their strategic negotiation. And they will also understand this concept of being a smart negotiator. In negotiating, it's very easy to say the wrong thing. And once you've said it, it's very difficult to retract it and to go back. So being a smart negotiator is all around understanding the different phases and the different steps of the cycle that we need to go through on any negotiation. So this tool is something that I've developed through my own research, this speed tool, and it breaks a negotiation down into 5 different components. These components are still geared around what happens before the negotiation, what happens during, and what happens after. But there are 5 different distinct components. Now, of course, in more tactical negotiating, we can still go through this process, but we will go through very quickly. And sometimes we think about stage and think, well, this is a lower importance contract, so maybe we don't even need to think about it. But we still actually go through the process. The more strategically important the contract and therefore the negotiation, the more time we will spend at each of these phases. So I'm going to run through quite quickly each phase just to give you a headline of what we would be doing at each step. So strategy, this is thinking about the backdrop and the background before we do anything. Really, one of the decisions within this would be to think about the nature of the contract and its importance, and to understand whether what will follow will be a strategic negotiation. So we need to think about its relative importance. We need to think about what's important to our organisation. So what are the internal drivers that we'd be looking to achieve? So it could be things around cost reduction, or it could be things around driving value through innovation, or maybe helping the organisation achieve its sustainability goals. So you can see with just those 3 examples, they're very different. And of course, it's important for us to understand those before we go into a strategic negotiation. We also need to understand what's happening in the market, what's changing, what companies would comprise our supply market, what they would think about us. What do we think about them? What gives us leverage? How many different options have we got? If on paper we think we haven't got many other options at all, is there something that we could do to create another option that would then reduce our dependency, but would also increase our leverage in the market? So there's a lot to do here to think about the backdrop, then against that strategic backdrop, we need to start our planning and preparations. And this is planning and preparing for the negotiation itself. There's a lot to do here. And of course, the amount of planning and preparation that we would do would depend very much on the nature of the negotiation. So the more important, the more complex the negotiation, then it follows the more detailed planning that we would undertake. It's worth adding at this stage that this strategic backdrop, the analysis and the planning, really should be viewed as an investment of our time. The better we are prepared, the greater the likelihood of a really great outcome. So we do need to think about who are the stakeholders, what are their needs and requirements, what targets are we going to have for the negotiation, what are our tradables, so therefore what things are we prepared to offer to the other party. Is there anything that we could offer them that actually is relatively low value to us, but they might really want? So these would be great for us to trade in a negotiation. Now, what are our absolute must-haves? This is really important to establish at the beginning, because we don't want to trade something away and then come back after the first phase of the negotiation, only for a stakeholder to say, but we really need that. Then we have to go back to the table and try and negotiate it back again. And then we have to think about more of the nuts and bolts, if you like, of the logistics. Where will it happen? When will it happen? Who will be involved in the current climate? Obviously, so we're thinking about which online digital media form are we going to use? What do the different platforms enable us to do? What don't they allow us to do? So it's added a whole different dimension to our planning and preparation. Are we going to negotiate on our own or as part of a team? If we're negotiating as a part of a team, make sure that every single person on our team knows what their role is. But more important, negotiations, we must have a rehearsal, we must have a meeting so that we really understand who is supposed to be doing what. Make sure we're all on the same page in terms of understanding the targets, understanding the strategy. And really there's a flip side to really virtually everything I've just said, because we need to understand what they will be doing. We need to understand, the other part of the dynamic. So who will we be negotiating with? Have we got some history with them so we can understand what different tools and techniques they use? Feel free to use influencing and persuasion tools. All of the really good professional strategic negotiators are great at using influencing and persuasion tools. And don't forget, they will be influencing and persuading you, and probably have already started the process of influencing and persuading your internal stakeholders. Okay, so be prepared to use the same elements of the toolkit on them and their stakeholders. It's a whole range of different tactics that we can use. And really, just to conclude the planning section, we need to be prepared for what will we do if we can't reach a deal. Okay, we can kid ourselves, we go through the strategy and all the planning and the analysis. So of course, it's just going to follow a natural path and we shake hands at the end and we all live happily ever after. Negotiating life, well, in fact, life in general doesn't necessarily work like that. So we need to be prepared. What will we do? And it seems a strange thing to put at the end here, but we need to think through, what will we do? What will we say at the very beginning of the negotiation meeting? Now, be very clear on this, be prepared, make sure you understand what messages you want to give them. Don't give anything away. And it's something that we need to rehearse with the team to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of this opening statement. So there's a lot to be done in terms of the planning and the preparation for a strategic negotiation. In terms of the negotiation itself, well, we need to keep to the plan. However, we need to be prepared to be flexible in the event that things don't go to plan, and maybe they might suggest something or they might say something that we weren't expecting. We might find that our plan actually isn't suited to the nature of the negotiation after all. So there's an easy way of tackling that if necessary. There's no reason why we couldn't call for a recess. We could regroup. So we need to be confident that we can be flexible where it's obvious that our plan isn't as appropriate as we thought. We do need to be confident. We need to be careful about what we're saying at the beginning. We do need to listen, observe, look at their body language. And of course, this is different depending on what medium we're using. So old school traditional negotiating would have been normally taking place in the same room where we can see everything. It's different now, so there will be some other considerations. Importantly, don't worry about interrupting the other party. And I'm not talking about doing this rudely, but if they say something and they're giving you an opportunity to take something in a negotiation. So maybe for example, they've given you a quote and they say, so you've seen the quote, but of course there is some flexibility. Well, that's the time to say to them, sorry to interrupt, what is the flexibility? By nature, we tend to be very polite and we let them finish. And of course, if we don't interrupt them and they carry on speaking for 2 or 3 minutes, it's very difficult to take that moment back. So this is why it's really important to be actively listening and looking out for these signals and these opportunities. But we must do it professionally and politely. Really important during the negotiation that if they're saying anything that we don't understand, or maybe they're talking about a price reduction and they're talking about a percentage. Now, when people talk percentages, we don't always know what the actual amount is. So there's nothing wrong with asking for clarification. And particularly in longer negotiation sessions, remember to summarize frequently. Now, we don't want to get to the end of a lengthy negotiation and try and summarize, try and ratify, when there were opportunities to have done that along the way. So we can do it in stages as we go. And it helps us on the journey so that when we get to the end, we've really summarized a point, we've summarized a point, we've summarized a point. So it's much easier to conclude the negotiation when we reach at the end. Obviously, keep notes, and I've already mentioned it's perfectly acceptable to take a recess. This next stage of evaluation is often a part of the negotiation process that we forget about. And maybe I'm speaking honestly about myself when I reflect back on my career, when we're so busy moving from job to job, from task to task, that when I reflect that I recognize now that I didn't do this enough. And I think it probably applies to a lot of people. I've already mentioned that negotiating, and especially strategic negotiating, is at least as much about behavior as the nuts and bolts of what we're negotiating. So for us to improve, we need to think about what is within our behavior that is positive, what things could we add to our behavior to elicit a better result. I've already said that when we're negotiating for our employer, we're a professional negotiator. So it's our responsibility to improve so that we can continually get better and better and better deals for our employers. So self-reflection is really important. At the end of every meeting, ideally, we should sit down, just take a few minutes and think about what went well, what worked less well, what did they do that was really good. Now, and one of the things that is a passionate mantra of mine that I believe very strongly in is that we take it for granted. We say that practice makes perfect, which of course practice is good. Practice is a positive. I'm not suggesting it isn't. But the more that we do things continually, the more permanently ingrained they become in our behavior, and it becomes much, much more difficult to change that behavior. So the more that we do something, even though it's not the best way of doing it, it feels norm and it's in our DNA, it's within our muscle memory. So to change it is quite difficult. So we need to identify just one or two things a step at a time, and we need to change that behaviour, because all that will happen is the next time we're in a pressure situation and we're in a negotiation, we would just revert to the old type. So it is about trying to break that muscle memory, to continually refresh the tools in the toolkit. And in the final stage of the process, it's well known that credibility is earned through delivery. It's pointless going through the process of a negotiation and agreeing all of the various terms and conditions if we, maybe ourselves or certainly our organisation, cannot then fulfil on the promises that we've made. It's all about the deal isn't done until it's been finally delivered and we've delivered on our promises, because apart from anything else, it's unprofessional. We've already established at the beginning that where we're looking at more strategic negotiating, that these are ongoing, more likely to be ongoing relationships, more likely to be collaborative relationships. And so we need to be able to demonstrate integrity, honesty, trust. So what we can't afford to do is to get to the end of the negotiation and have made a lot of commitments only for us to then not follow through on those commitments. And the important thing to say as well is that when we conclude, because not all negotiations will conclude happily, the supplier might not be able to do what it is that we want or vice versa. It's always best to finish on positive, amicable terms, because we may think that we don't need them now, but who knows what the future holds. Maybe in 6 months' time, 12 months' time, we actually might need to go back to them. So we want them to have a positive recollection, a positive experience of dealing with us. And then just finally, some conclusions and to reiterate, and I'll pick just a few of these top points out. Strategic negotiating, a lot of this is about behaviour. The really important thing is to understand ourselves, understand what our natural behaviours are and how they might impact the other party. Professional negotiators will be adaptable. Professional negotiators will do what it takes within the code of ethics, within our boundaries of professionalism, but they will do what it takes to adapt their behaviours to get the best deal for their organisation. This adaptation must be authentic. So we're looking at making just a few small fine-tuning changes, but we must behave ethically. And of course, inherent within all of this is that we must understand what the best deal is before we get to the end. So this is why our strategy and our planning and our preparations are really important, because otherwise we're just blindly going into a negotiation, and we need to have some structure and a framework. And really the final point is, do take an opportunity to reflect, learn, adapt your approach. Remember, practice does make perfect, but practice also makes permanent. And the more that we do something, the more challenging it becomes for us to change. I think, Danielle, I'll stop there because I know you've got some questions to ask. Yeah. And as you know, I can speak about negotiating for a long time. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Colin. And I think sharing the speed model has just simplified that process and hopefully helps people to plan effectively better. So I have got a few questions as normal, as ever. So negotiation is obviously more of a technical skill, but you mentioned soft skills a number of times, and it's heavily reliant on people's inherent soft skills. So could you be a bit more specific about those and how people can improve those skills to help with the negotiation process?
Yes, it's a good question, Danielle, that we need to recognise that these behaviours, so our emotional intelligence and of course the other party, they will have a significant impact on relationships, but also on the outcome of a negotiation. Mm-hmm. So by soft skills, we can describe them as emotional intelligence. So conventional intelligence is very different. Emotional intelligence, is about being empathetic. It is about understanding other people, understanding ourselves, and for a professional negotiator, we need to feel confident about digging into this portion of our toolkit that we're comfortable using these softer skills like persuasion, like influence. Really important parts of this, will be things like body language, will be things like active listening, listening to these signals that are given. So people with high emotional intelligence will be very, very good at doing this. And of course, it's always a risk in a negotiation that the other party or parties might be highly trained in this. I can reflect on my career, and I probably spent around 50% of my time in procurement related roles and the other 50% in sales and marketing. So when I think about my procurement roles, most of my training and development was around more technical areas, doing my CIPS qualification, or technical elements of the job. Whereas when I moved into sales and marketing, in fact, when I was a sales manager, all of my training was soft skills.
Yeah.
So I was being trained in how to influence, how to build relationships. So, of course, training, CIPS provide a huge amount of training in this space. And I'm also a fan of trying it out. We have many, many, many opportunities in our daily lives to practice negotiating. So, for some of us, some cultures are more naturally inclined to negotiate, whereas we here in the UK tend not to negotiate. Well, why not? It's a great opportunity to just practice our skills, negotiate at every single opportunity and then reflect on what worked well, what worked less well. So I think a lot of it is personal development, but certainly feel free to get some training, because there's this view: are you born with these skills or can you develop them? Absolutely, they can be developed and improved.
Great, thank you, Colin. And I think you can humanise the situation as well. Obviously, it's a negotiation that you're going into, and it's a professional negotiation for your organisation, and you've got a plan, but humanising that in terms of the people who you'll be dealing with and adapting is really important. And that comes down to inherent soft skills, really, doesn't it? So, and that adaptability, and that's kind of what needs to be worked on.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point, Danielle. I've got numerous books on organisational behaviour. Organisations don't behave.
No.
It's the people within them. And so it's a really, really important point that we are trying to influence, trying to build a relationship, trying to build rapport with that individual, those individuals that we're negotiating with. So it's a really important point, Danielle, that you make.
Great, thank you. And you talked about having a plan and keeping to it, yet you need to be able to change if necessary, if the negotiation's going a different route or you feel like you need to stop. So can you just explain just a bit more about that? I'm quite intrigued to know a bit more about keeping to the plan, but then being flexible. At what point you know when to do this and how that works? That'd be really helpful.
Yes, I realise as I was saying it that it almost sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? That we say, well, yes, let's have a plan, but be prepared to change that plan if the circumstances require you to do so.
And having the confidence, I think, to do that as well. I think that's one of the points. So, yes. Yeah,
and I think this is what we gain through experience, that a more experienced negotiator will sense. So this is emotional intelligence. We get that feeling. We get that sense that we set out with a plan to go in this direction, and all of a sudden we're stuck, and it's taken us in a different direction, but we don't want to go there. And so this intuition of telling us that actually, for whatever reason, the plan wasn't quite right. We see this in a whole range of different sports. It's in terms of strategy and planning, professional sports would be a great analogy, because it doesn't matter what the sport is, that the two opposing coaches, two opposing teams will have their strategy and their plan. And once they get out onto the pitch, of course, the play out, the execution is delivered on the pitch, not on paper. And so we can think that something might go in a certain direction on paper. When we actually get to the realities of the practical execution, things would be different. And so it is about recognizing, understanding when things aren't quite going to plan. And this is one of the reasons why it's really important for us to have a range of targets. So we shouldn't go into a negotiation with just one target, with just one number or one part of the terms and conditions we want to agree on, or one metric, one KPI. We should have a range. So we should set our goal for each of these areas that, well, let's see if we can get the impossible. Why not? We might be able to get the impossible, so don't set our sights too low. And of course, we rarely achieve the impossible. Sometimes we do. But if we don't achieve the impossible, what would our next best option be, taking into account our relative positioning within the market? If we can't get that, what would be the minimum acceptable to our stakeholders? If we can't get that, is our walk away. The really important thing with a walk away is we must have somewhere to walk.
Yep.
Because otherwise you can't reach a walk away and walk, get back to the office or log off from your Zoom call and then realise, oh, we've got nowhere else to go. So that's why the planning and the preparation, and think through in more complex strategic negotiating, think about different scenarios. So think about what if they say this? We're making this assumption, but what if they've assumed something else? So thinking through in our strategic thinking and our planning, and particularly using scenarios, will help us on that journey and will help us adapt our plan. And there is nothing wrong in a negotiation if they really hit us with a curveball and it's a really great point, it's a really great thing that we hadn't thought of. There's nothing wrong with saying to them in a negotiation, well, yeah, we've not thought about that. You need to give us time to regroup as a team, or we might need to talk to somebody else. And so depending on the significance of that, maybe we have to call a halt to the negotiation and reconvene another time, or we just take a recess. I think it's a really great idea. We need to just think it through. Perhaps, let's just take a 20-minute comfort break, grab a coffee. It would just give us a chance, and then we can get back to it. So it is about being confident, and the fact that something happens that takes us off track isn't the end of the world. So we do need to have a plan, but we do need to be prepared, because it's pointless, isn't it, having a plan if it turns out to be a disastrous plan and we just slavishly follow it, even though we know that it's leading us to defeat. And say that sports analogies are great at this, where the two teams go out onto the pitch and one coach has come up with their response, but they didn't take into account that the opposing team has now suddenly got a different formation.
Yeah.
So be prepared to be flexible.
I think the importance that you've placed on planning and that phase is really important, and the planning for different scenarios. But like you said, you can't plan for every scenario, and there may be things that come up. So it's just having the confidence and being able to kind of call a halt, like you say, or kind of change your direction confidently. So no, that's really helpful. Thank you, Colin. And going back to soft skills a little bit, so body language and signals is really important. So can you tell us a bit more about those signals and the importance of body language in a negotiation?
Yeah, well, it's well known through research, this type of communication, behavioural psychology has been heavily researched for many, many years. So most of us will recognise that the words that we actually say constitute a relatively small amount of the totality of the communication. So we do need to be mindful of other signals that we will be giving and that the other party would be giving. As you know, a really good example, you know, Danielle, because I think I've mentioned this before, you know, I'm quite expressive when I'm doing it now and I can't. And so what you'll be seeing is, you know, my fingertips very often, because you've not got the entirety of all of the non-verbal communication. So generally speaking, most theorists recognise that it's broadly 50-50. Some theorists say that actually less than 50% of the communication relates to the words themselves, more than 50% is non-verbal. And of course, using digital online media, using the telephone, you know, adds a whole different dimension. So this is something for us to think about. You know, we need to understand that we don't get the totality of the communication. So, for instance, if I'd had my camera switched off, then the communication would have been even less than we would have got because we're not in the same room together. And so we just need to be mindful of that and think about the different tools and techniques that we might want to use. So a good example would be, and something that believe it or not, I use myself a lot, right? And I sort of question it sometimes, because I could definitely speak in the Olympics and I could be contending for a gold medal. But I also like the use of silence in a negotiation because it can be really impactful. And particularly for somebody like me, who's very chatty and I do talk a lot, when suddenly I don't say anything, it suddenly goes, it's strange, isn't it? Because that's probably the longest. It's probably the longest that you have heard me not talking. And particularly, you know, if you've made a really good point or you've asked them a really good direct question. So, Daniel, you're telling me, is this the best deal that you could do? And I'm leaving the ball in your court to give me a response. Now, it's much more difficult to do, of course, via online digital channels or by the telephone, because, of course, immediately I say nothing.
It's an awkward silence, isn't it?
It's awkward silence, but you're also thinking, has he got technology? Is there a technology issue? And it then kind of undermines, and particularly if, you know, I'm negotiating as a team and I've got my team partners in a row and we're all in different locations, because one of them might think, oh, as Colin often has broadband issues, I'm not sure. And of course they could then interrupt. So it is really important. You know, we need to understand, we need to really listen and observe, just to see whether what they're telling us, you know, is absolutely compelling. You can do some eye contact, maybe just about in this, but, you know, we often take our eye off. I mean, I'm taking my eye off just to look at my watch. You know, I'm looking to get a drink. So body language is still important. So we just need to think through and understand about ourselves and what different techniques we use and what would be appropriate based on the medium that we're using. Because, you know, gone are the days, certainly for the foreseeable future, where we'll be traveling around the world having face-to-face negotiations. You know, this is the new norm, isn't it?
Well, it is the new norm, yes. And I was going to say about that, obviously, when there's different teams in different locations and things, and with body language being so important, do you have any tips or anything on negotiating virtually and things that people could be more mindful of?
Yeah, I think certainly the main thing would be to be aware of the sometimes limitations, but the differences in the various channels that we now use, you know, ranging from email, telephone, audio conferencing, video conferencing, and of course the platforms themselves are different and have different capabilities. Certainly, if I'm leading on a negotiation, you know, I'd want to understand what the platform is, so whether it's WebEx, whether it's Zoom, whether it's Teams, whether it's any of the others, and I'd want to feel comfortable in using it. So having a rehearsal with that. I think also one of the things that we know that helps to make a negotiation success, and that's building rapport. We need to think about ways that we can build rapport with people in this online environment, so people that we might have never met face to face. In fact, I don't think we've met face. We might have.
We haven't. No, we've spoken so many times now, but no, we haven't met face.
No, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because we have spoken so many times over the last year or so that I actually now can't remember whether we have met. In my many visits up to CIPS HQ, that I can no longer differentiate now between you as somebody, whether I've met in the real world or whether we've just got this professional relationship built up virtually. So these are considerations. It is about being aware. It's about thinking about what we would like to do and whether there is any limitation. And of course, the main limitation is, generally speaking, all we get is a headshot and the words that are being said. That said, we can pick up a lot of the non-verbal communications in this form. Where there's no camera, much more difficult. Personally, as a personal preference, if I'm on the receiving end of training, I would much rather see the person who's delivering and the materials, because I feel more engaged with it, versus can't see the person and it feels like a soundtrack. It's difficult now because, of course, the theorists would tell us that there is no substitute for that physical presence where you can see the entirety of the negotiation. And maybe it's easier moving into a virtual world where we're dealing with people that we know in the real world. But I don't know. I'd not really thought about it, Danielle, until that moment. That, and it's probably the same with other people, that I now can't differentiate between those that I've met in real life and those that I've only met virtually, because we still have a chat about what we did at the weekend and what our interests are. So it can be done. Maybe it just takes a little bit more effort to do that, and that's where influencing and persuasion is very useful, but might need a little bit more thought. Maybe to have some less formal exchanges with the other party, just in the build up to a negotiation would be useful.
Yes, and understand their motivations as well is really important, isn't it? So that you can plan effectively. Okay. One of the other things you talked about was self-reflection, which I think is really important. And you talked about that over your career and thinking about changing behaviours, what you could do better. Can you just explain a little bit more about that, what you learned? And did, for example, you use other departments and things to do self-reflection? Is that helpful? It would just be really useful to understand your journey, really.
Yeah, it's a really, really important part of one's certainly career, but we could broaden it out generally in terms of our personalities, relationships that we build with people, and to understand why those relationships have gone in different directions, and sometimes maybe a direction that we had hoped it wouldn't. And an important part of this is really understanding ourselves, understanding our core, and particularly how we naturally behave when we're in a pressurized situation, such as a strategic negotiation. Strategic negotiating, we know these are our most important contracts. These are our most important suppliers. So it's highly pressurized, particularly if we're working for a commercial enterprise and the other parties from a commercial enterprise. We will immediately have conflicting goals. Even though we're collaborating and we're looking to get a win-win, we want to get the best deal that we can, so do they. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a commercial enterprise. Public bodies would be the same, because they would want to get a deal that serves the public the best and the public purse, whereas their probably commercial supplier wants to get the best deal for their shareholders. So inherent often there is this conflict. And so the first point really is understanding what we do and how we act and how we behave in a conflict situation.
Mm-hmm.
Psychometric tests are a useful way of doing that. Or maybe even thinking when you are in a conflict situation and under pressure, think about how you did react. Did you say something that you later reflect on and think, I wish I hadn't said that because it's taken us down a different path? It's very powerful to observe other people as well. And really after every meeting, it's worth reflecting on how it went. Yeah. Is there something I did that perhaps I could have done differently? Now, particularly if it's a negotiation, because a negotiation is a series of discussions with an end goal. It's got an aim. There's a point of conflict on which we're looking to find a resolution. And maybe we have resolved it, and maybe we've achieved an agreement. But the thing to reflect on is, what was the journey? How did we get there? Could I have got a better deal? Professional negotiator, the fact that we've shaken hands on the deal and we've concluded the deal, was it really the best? Was it the best that I could have got? In internal meetings as well, and certainly it's easier in an internal meeting to ask for feedback from someone else who's been in the room. It's much more difficult, isn't it, to ask a supplier?
External.
I can't ever think of a situation where I've had a really tough negotiation with a supplier. It's felt like we've been in the boxing ring sometimes because we've got points of conflict. We managed to find a resolution and we've reached a deal. That probably isn't the time to say to them, well, I thought that went reasonably well. Would you like to give me some personal feedback? If we know the supplier really well, and maybe over time, there might be an opportunity to do that, but certainly easier. And of course, conventional wisdom around training and development, giving feedback, would lead us to conclude that someone is much more likely to give you a learning point, so some negative feedback on a point of development, if you allow them to give you some positive feedback. So, maybe ask them, if it's an internal stakeholder, could they tell you something that you did really well and something that you could learn from for future development? The really important thing with this is, don't identify too many things that you want to change, because I guarantee you won't change anything. Now, if you come up with a list after a negotiation of 50 things that you think you should do differently, you'll just stick with everything. So it's small, continuous change. And the secret with this, because we know that practice makes permanent, how do you take on board a change? So maybe that change could be, I'm going to use silence more.
Yes.
How do you build that into your routine? Because what will happen if you don't try to build that into your routine is that in the next time you're in a pressure situation, you will revert to type, and your muscle memory will take you back to everything else that you did, which is talking too much, not listening enough, rather than what you learned from the previous negotiation that said, just listen a bit more. Listen a bit more. Feel free to interrupt. Make sure you use silence more. And so it is about thinking through. I'll share a tip, because you asked a question on what I would do. So a tip that I do, and I do to this day, that if I think of something that I really should stop doing, do more of, something that I've learned from someone else, I put that down on the task section in my calendar for a couple of months' time. And it would say, remember to listen more. Remember to interrupt more politely. Remember to use silence more. And unfortunately, almost without exception, I'll forget about that until 2 months' time. It will come up in my schedule, and with this, just a short list of things that I should do. And then it is worth putting that back in, maybe not for 2 months' time, but just for a month's time. Mm-hmm. And eventually, we can build this into our DNA, our natural position, and it becomes our new permanent. Because it really, really is hard to change our natural behaviours. But definitely, it is all about self-development, And everything that we do is so many meetings, so many discussions, so much of what we do is really useful in terms of observing our soft skills.
Yes, and being open to change. I think that's important as well, isn't it? For yourself and throughout the negotiation as well. So that was really helpful. Thank you, Colin. Great as always. I think hopefully everyone listening today will have taken away some great tips there from you that they'll be able to put into practice, and good luck with all your negotiations in the future. Thank you again for your time today. Always a pleasure to have you here and do the podcast with us. And we hope you join us again soon. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Danielle.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.